Watchmen is the 1986 graphic novel by Detective Comics, sold in the form of separate issues cataloging the events of an alternate vision of 80s America and its involvement in the Cold War from different points of view. The novel serves as a deconstruction of heroism and superhero culture, which was the predominant genre of comic books at the time, and does so by injecting aspects like realism and moral ambiguity. It proved to be immensely popular due to its deviation from the norm of uncritical superhero stories focused on heroic antics, which had by that point become perceived as mundane and uninteresting, especially owing to the largely conservative climate of culture and politics around the world. But due to the specificity of the story itself hinging on certain perspectives and worldviews to be bought into, it has not aged well. Before we get into the story itself, couple of things. This will be full of spoilers. It's a 35-year-old book. You should just go read it. Secondly, there is some much-needed context to be provided. Watchmen is one of the products of what has been called the comic counterculture movement, or the dark age of American comic books. This movement sought to revolutionize the comic book industry by trying to evolve the medium instead of letting it stagnate. It was primarily influenced by a counterculture movement of artists and writers within America seeking to redefine their childhood heroes. This is where you get your Frank Miller, your Larry Hama, your Bernie Wrightson, your Mike Mignola, and other similar types. The popularity and influence of British writers and artists opposing their own regional industry, Pat Mills and John Wagner specifically. Often called the Lee Kirby of Britain, they made a splash much before the 80s through the magazine Action writing war stories. Later, Pat Mills founded 2000 AD, and the rest is a history lesson we will get into in brief. But this is where you get your Morrisons, your Moores, your Gaimans, your Alan Grants, Dave Gibbons, Brian Bolins, etc., etc. The works coming out of France, particularly the works of Jean-Giraud Moebius, Tintin, and Asterix. There was stuff from Italy too, mostly porn, but that wasn't popular stateside. The works coming out of Japan, which are popular now but were minuscule back then. Golgo 13 and Lone Wolf and Cub were some of the first manga which were popular in the States back in the 70s, Larry Hama and Frank Miller in particular being some of the first open fans of Lone Wolf and Cub at the time. Frank Miller even pushed for the Dark Horse omnibuy of Lone Wolf and Cub and drew cover art for them. There was also the U.S. exclusive supercut of the Japanese Lone Wolf and Cub movies, Shogun Assassin, but that's for another time. Coming back to Watchmen. This particular book is written by Alan Moore, who is a British writer from 2000 AD. A very brief overview of 2000 AD, it was a British comic magazine dedicated to spreading communism to children. Oh, wait. No, it was a counterculture comic magazine, which was meant to be a British version of Metal Hurlant, heavy metal for you Muricons and Canucks. Sorry for the technical difficulties there, things got a bit out of hand. Anyways, most of the British writers who went to write for American companies were popular, and they were popular from 2000 AD. Watchmen was Alan Moore's attempt to write a story focused on realism and superhero deconstruction using the characters from his childhood, forgettable characters of the week from various comic book publishers who went extinct, characters from a particular publisher called Charlton Comics, who were bought out by DC and whose characters were appropriated by DC. It was also an attempt to give something nostalgic to read for people of Moore's generation of the time, as they also would have grown up with the same characters but would be facing contemporary issues as adults. It was by no means a first attempt, as Alan Moore is very famous, particularly in Britain, for initiating superhero deconstruction as a genre with his run on Miracle Man in the magazine Warrior. Miracle Man, also known as Marvelman, was another character from the then-extinct Fawcett comics, who was famous for being a Superman clone and a replacement for the Fawcett character Captain Marvel, converted to Shazam by DC, who acquired him as compensation in a legal battle. This allowed writers like him of that generation to revive interest in old characters by infusing them with contemporary culture. So he proposed Watchmen to DC, along with 2000 AD artist Dave Gibbons, as a story revolving around the Cold War with the characters from Charlton Comics. DC allowed him to go ahead with it on the condition that the Charlton characters are not involved, as it would destroy future possibilities with Charlton properties. So I'm not going to break down the entire story here. Just so we're clear, again, you should just go read it. I do recommend. To be very brief, it's about the socio-political events in the 1980s involving the existence of superheroes and their involvement in global conflict, particularly the Cold War. I'm just going to talk about the stuff on top: characters, interpretations, Easter eggs, relevance, stuff like that, a bit of movie stuff here and there too. Don't ask me about that garbage which people call a TV show or the before comics. I don't care. They don't exist. The characters of Watchmen are the most debated part of the story. With good reason. The story itself is written like a CRPG. Each character is complex and different from one another, written in relation to a central event in the world. In the additional material sold as part of the campaign for the novel, particularly the companion, there are various descriptions of the Charlton characters and what they were replaced with. Mind you, these characters do not just serve to be nostalgia or philosophical abstractions, as they already are, but were also meant as analogues to contemporary superheroes in a lot of cases, the obvious ones being Dr. Manhattan and Superman, Rorschach and Batman. So, without further ado, this is the Superman analog with a twist, a scientist who turns into a godlike figure due to a freak accident. Also, like a god, he becomes disconnected from humanity as his mind is overexposed to information and stimuli. This is in complete contrast to Superman, who is the humane everyman, with all the conceivable power on the planet, a titanic figure of polished moral caliber. Manhattan, on the other hand, is a lot more hands-off and mechanic. He shows some propensity towards human emotion, but is also extremely efficient at solving situations and handling scenarios. This is contrasted with the commentary, which is thrust onto him by the writer, which is explained by the actions taken by the U.S. government on him. He's used as a weapon of destruction by the government in their affairs abroad, classic commentary on neocons and the military-industrial complex. But the thing is, he isn't manipulated into it. He does it mostly of his own accord, except, of course, when he decides not to. Manhattan is not only supposed to signify how godlike powers and infinite information can lead to detachment from humanity, but is also used to present the liberal/neoliberal point of view of the world due to his actions in the story. Despite having an almost unlimited view of the future and actions of humanity, he does not exert free will and assumes a godlike position over humanity, i.e. no exertion of will, complete moral relativism, and non-involvement. He has no moral positions on almost anything. He always takes the path of least resistance and almost never explicitly questions orders, except, of course, towards the end. Even towards the end, when he does question things, he still ends up helping Veidt cover up the genocide of many millions due to the outcome being a positive one, despite Manhattan himself not being a consequentialist. In short, libtarded, path of least resistance, moral relativist, all that. Also, and this is funny, he is supposed to be one of two characters who was written as a self-insert. You need proof? If you read the extras in the Absolute Edition, he is described in a sympathetic fashion as alienated and isolated. You need more proof? In the late 70s, Alan Moore was in a polyamorous relationship with two women, one of whom had both his daughters and both of whom left him taking the girls with them. After the book was published, of course. That's all I need to say about that. This is the guns-blazing guy, just likes to walk around shooting things. He is supposed to represent the average red-blooded military man and the neocon point of view. He sees himself a superior type of person and assumes responsibility to exert order and civilization over presumed inferior cultures and groups of people. Sometimes he is right, other times he is not. The American dream line might be iconic, but he is right there. It was his responsibility to bring order to that deranged crowd at home. In Vietnam, not so much, but since he is representing neoconservatism that is inserted in there since neocons love colonialism and expansionism in the name of spreading freedom. Of course, he is also made out to be psychopathic and trigger-happy to strawman gun-wielding folk in general. It's not quite valid outside of being an entertaining depiction of personality-infused military men. There's also the backstory of him being a World War II vet who served in the Pacific Islands, which feeds into the stuff mentioned before, which is very interesting. This is the communist with a God complex. It really is that simple. He is the one rich guy who thinks himself a savior of humanity, and he would bring about peace by killing 1 million people. I know Godwin's law is a thing, and I don't want to bring it up as it's really overused, but I don't see no difference. A moral consequentialist who is okay with killing millions to bring peace is really no different from Mustache Man. It's as simple as that. Also, he is the only rich guy who I've seen communists excuse the actions of, like he's straight up a bourgeois with all the money, bells, and whistles. He is even called self-made in the extras, despite communists saying the concept of self-made millionaires doesn't exist as somebody has to suffer. Everything is zero-sum, isn't it? Really speaks volumes. This is the second half of the Alan Moore self-insert, especially with him jacking off Veidt in the extras as the most intelligent man in the world with all the resources and a huge philanthropic mindset, not completely untrue but very hypocritical as expected of commies. Makes sense. Nothing to say, average herd-minded Joe represents the centrist civilian, would sway with the wind even if it snapped him in half. Night owl, but female. Cucked Dr. Manhattan with a fat guy. Supposed to represent the contemporary feminist archetype of the women with everything who settled for normalcy. Annie from The Boys did her arc better than she did. The most interesting character apart from Dr. Manhattan. The Batman analog in the story, coupled with couple of references, mainly the works of Steve Ditko. Rorschach is supposed to represent the supposed fascist point of view of a paranoid schizophrenic due to his inspiration, Steve Ditko's Mr. A from the magazine Whitsand, my namesake. Being a character based on the philosophy of Ayn Rand, Mr. A posited ideas of objective morality and acted as a manifestation of justice itself, with his calling card being black and white, representing good and evil. This character can be called a political mouthpiece for Steve Ditko, with enough evidence supporting the same, not to necessarily dismiss the character or the concepts espoused, but it really was just a harmless collection of moral parables meant for children. Moore, due to his political differences and polarized nature, disliked Mr. A and the ideas espoused by Ditko, which led him to propose Rorschach as an exaggerated version of Mr. A. The exaggerations would include, but not be limited to added psychopathy, extreme misanthropy, paranoia, aggression, and violent tendencies, a lot of which can apply to Moore himself depending on context. This is fine in a self-contained bubble. Outside the world of Watchmen, Rorschach could be a villainous character in line with Moore's intention to depict his political opponents. But in the story, ironically enough, Rorschach is the most virtuous character, which is the most interesting and surprising aspect of the story. Rorschach, in his paranoia and obsession with being honest and finding the truth about everything, ends up being objectively correct, if you can pardon the pun, about almost all information in Veidt's conspiracy. He just wanted to find the truth and bring justice. He might have been a bit brutal in his methodology, resorting often to violence, but in almost every context he was justified. The only instance where he isn't is when he is a hypocrite who excuses the actions of the comedian as a moral lapse, but otherwise in every other instance he was right. Then towards the end, Manhattan killed him as he wanted to reveal the truth of the genocide to the world, jeopardizing the peace built upon blood. Moore set up Rorschach as a psychopath whose paranoid actions almost destroyed humanity, but unwittingly sets up a philosophical conflict between truth and peace, justice and stability, and poses the question if one can be sacrificed for the other, considering the moral value of such a sacrifice. This conflict also implies a variety of things when applied to real-world contexts, things which people who are fans of the book might not necessarily be fans of. Anyways, Rorschach did nothing wrong, absolutely nothing wrong. There are a lot of other aspects to the comic series itself. There is the Voyage of the Black Freighter short story, which is a study of how despair causes corruption, and corruption leads to self-sabotage or Armageddon in the case of the story. There is the alt history stuff with Nixon and Vietnam, which is pretty cool, although Soviet infiltration of the West is pretty conveniently ignored. There are a lot of references to pulp heroes, particularly the first Night Owl, whose costume is partially a nod to the Phantom. The catchphrase, "Who watches the Watchmen," which is supposed to be a cynical opposition to vigilantism by rebranding it as authoritarianism. The Watchmen are directly blamed for authoritarian tendencies despite working at the behest of the government. Things like that. Also, this is addressed to Almighty Lolly. The original team in the book were not always the crime busters, but the Minutemen, like in the film. Moore left it at the cutting room floor. It's something mentioned in the extras. That's a good segue into the film, which is one of the best superhero films of all time, probably. I'd put it up there with The Dark Knight Returns, Iron Man, and Logan. The ultimate cut is the only good way to watch it, although it butchers some parts of the theatrical release. Not the comic, but the theatrical release. Particularly the funeral of the comedian, which had Sound of Silence play throughout the scene in the theatrical release, and had the song play only for the first half of the scene in the ultimate cut, before it cuts to Sally Jupiter, which sucks a bit. Small nitpicks like that, otherwise it's a very good movie, the ultimate cut, I mean. So yeah, that is Watchmen, complex and flawed, but a pretty great piece of media made by some mad people. I've been Mr. A, and I'll see you next time.